Morgan, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
It is such a thrill to have you here because you are someone that I have wanted to get on the show for ages. And you've got an amazing story to tell, and we'll come on and look at that. But I want to start off by giving my listeners a sense of why I just said that, because you and I met and we're working in very similar spaces. And anybody that gets involved in the sort of ethics and compliance space, there's normally some sort of reason why that happened. Talk to us a little bit about how you came to that.
Well, when I was in junior high school, my dad, he had always worked in the big banks, and he left his job as a very successful banker to start his own wealth management company, basically because what he saw in the banking space, he thought was unethical. And so I kind of watched him do that and build a business based on ethics. And so this idea that you can make money and be ethical was something that I very much watched as a youngster and as a teen. And when I went to university for my undergraduate degree, I started thinking that I would go into business. And then I took a business ethics class, an introductory business ethics class, and had an amazing professor and basically ended up switching gears. And so I did my undergraduate degree, did a minor in applied ethics, and then I went on later on to do a master's in applied ethics at Utrecht University in 2010. And once I graduated from my undergrad, all my friends who had done business were kind of talking about what they were going to do in business and making a few jokes. Like, what are you going to do? Like, work at the ethics factory? But I ended up getting a job in the ethics department of a large Canadian corporation. And they were just starting to build the team. It was 2006. And I got a window into the early ethics and compliance programs in a way that I feel tremendously grateful for. So that was the beginning.
I love that and I love that personal connection because it's not, and I hope this changes in a way, but it's not a career path the average kid would kind of go, I'm going to go into the ethics space, which is why it becomes a little bit of a joke. And so you've got this insight that I guess most people wouldn't have. And then the spark is lit as part of your academic career. And then you move into space. And how was developing that? Because I think it's a really interesting time because that's when these things are starting to shift. And I'm guessing if you're coming into an organization that's just set one up, there's a lot to do, but also I guess there's a degree of freedom about how you go about doing it.
Absolutely, Christian. And I remember my first idea that I had when I got in was to do we basically had these introductory integrity workshops that we would run for people around the world. And I had this idea that if we really want people to trust the system and to know that if they raise a concern, it will be investigated. If wrongdoing is found, something will be done about it, that we should actually share cases that had actually happened within the organization. And so I pitched it to leadership. Keep in mind, I'm a recent grad, very new. And at first, the legal department was like, no way, we're not going to do this, from a confidentiality perspective. And I said, well, what if we could both respect confidentiality, ensure that the people who might have been involved in this, that there would be no repercussion for them, and also tell these stories in a way that would help strengthen our culture and really help people trust the system. And also, to be honest, that are really interesting, right? We had the kinds of things as working in the ethics space that come up are things that people talk about at cocktail parties. These are the fascinating things of life when I think. And so basically we had a really strong general counsel at the time, and he ended up giving the go ahead. And so we created this video where we featured 5 cases, one on drugs and alcohol, one on inappropriate use of IT assets, which you can imagine what that is in the UK. And we created this video, and basically it was the hit of the workshop. People loved it because it was interesting and human and real. And so that was what a kind of strong highlight for me, was taking a creative approach, making it real for people. And I felt really grateful to have the opportunity to do that.
I love that idea. And there's various bits I want to unpick there. One was the start point is this seems like a good idea, right? So you're thinking not about the constraints, which is often the driver, right? We can't do that because we've never done it. And people come up with a million excuses. You're just thinking from a human perspective of what is going to be compelling. And the bit I think is interesting about that is we know that this content is compelling, right? Netflix creates documentaries about this stuff, right? Situations, right? Those are hits. So we know that people there's a little bit of like, what the hell? There's a bit of gossip. It fascinates human beings. These stories
Yes.
resonate with people. And so the idea of saying we're sitting on stuff that I'm not saying it's all Netflix worthy in terms of the seriousness of it, right? But it's that kind of subject matter. And you're just going, I know this will land, right? So if I'm going to do my job properly, I need to not lecture people about being ethical. I need to connect with them. And so you've taken something, just not, and it's probably not even the logic of going Netflix does this. It's just subliminally, you've approached this thing, gone, this is this, and then you hit the logic wall, right? Which is that we can't possibly do this. And here's a million reasons why, some of which, of course, are legitimate. But I think this is really fascinating because if we're trying to communicate a subject to people that they're not familiar with, they might see that we have these weird rules. They don't understand what they're there for. Why do we need I don't need help being ethical. I'm fine, all that kind of stuff. And you're making it real for people. And so I love this idea. And I suspect it's this kind of youthful, in the nicest possible way, naivety, right? You just go, well, this is the way we're going to do things. And
100%.
and then you take on the machine and you get them to do it. And this is what I love, because there are so many people I speak to with decades of experience who go, we would never be allowed to do that when I suggest it. And you've just illustrated it can be done. Sure. And of course, there's an interesting thing here because you want to talk about the things, but also recognize that from a psychological perspective, if people think they're going to be the subject of a video, that has all sorts of ramifications. And so you do need to think about these protections to like a witness protection program type logic of keeping people's identities secure and that. And so I love this. So you muddle through all this thing and then you get it done. That's the bit that I think is cool here.
Yeah, it was really fun. We ended up actually traveling, like flying out to do the interviews. So one image in particular, I flew down to Louisiana and we got on a helicopter and went out to one of these platforms in the Gulf of Mexico and interviewed all of these fellows on the rig about their experience, right? And I think it was very memorable for me and then I think ultimately for people in the workshop, for sure.
This is a great example of the sort of creative thinking that you brought to bear. And how did your career kind of evolve from there?
So I spent 11 years working in the ethics office at that organization. And so during that time, I worked on many of the things that we traditionally think about in terms of ethics and compliance. I worked on our code of conduct. Basically, at one point, we had a number of different like ethics related policies and needed them to be basically combined into one code of conduct. And I managed that project, which was really fascinating. One of the things that I did there that I think was a little bit unique and that I am now still doing in my work today is went through the process of basically trying to calibrate words and actions. So this idea that ideally what we put out into the world externally is a reflection of how we actually behave, right? In terms of if we want to create trust with our stakeholders, what we have on our website, what we have in our code of conduct should be not how we hope to be, but how we are. And a lot of what I see and what we all see in terms of marketing and promotional materials and even any codes of conduct often are these aspirational things that maybe don't reflect how things are actually done. And understanding kind of what I do about behavioral ethics, I thought, well, this is a really interesting opportunity to actually connect with the subject matter experts on each of these areas, whether it was safety or conflicts of interest or record keeping or whatever it might be. And what I did was I basically drafted the section on like, this is how we work. And I sent it to them and said, I would love for you to please review this, letting me know, is this level of language appropriate? Or is it underneath, like, is it not quite showcasing how good we are? Or is it too high? Is it making it appear as if we're better than we are? And basically, if it's too high, we should lower it. Or we should take the step to do training or education or whatever we might need to do in order to get our behavior up to that level or change the policy or whatever. But just this idea of kind of like helping the organization more closely align its action with its words is something that I've always been very interested in.
I love this because I think this points to the fundamental, and I don't think people set out to be dishonest, but there's a fundamental challenge, which is lots of organizations, as you say, we've got to put something out, particularly in a regulated environment, right? We wouldn't want to say we are an unethical organization. And then, so they go to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the sort of like, ideally, this is the model answer that we would have, and we'll put that out there. And we will hope that by saying that we are these things, that actually the truth will kind of follow, right? And I love the fact that you've just gone, is this realistic, right? So you've applied the kind of test that I guess if we had advertising regulations about what you are allowed to say, you've
Mhm.
applied that and kind of gone, does this actually, is this really what people are experiencing? In other words, if you were to ask the average employee, would they recognize this, right? Or is this just aspirational BS? And I
Right.
love the fact that because you've gone to the big question there, right? Which is to say, we don't want to lie. We don't want
Right.
to misrepresent the realities of the world because people will see that for what it is. And then everything becomes fiction.
100%. And sometimes I have to say, Christian, like sometimes people are uncomfortable with this approach. They are because that kind of veneer, there's a lot that feels good about that. Like people we like to think of ourselves as ethical people. We like to think of our organizations as ethical. But what I have come to believe this is there is something actually like quite refreshing with acknowledging where we're at. And it doesn't mean that we can't get better, but trying to align those words more closely with actions is, in my experience, a better approach because then employees, as you say, aren't looking around thinking this ethics stuff is a bunch of BS. They're thinking like, okay, here's where we're at. We're working on being better, but at least we can kind of trust it.
Right. So in many respects, you're looking at it saying we should be thinking in terms of floors rather than ceilings, right? So this is where we're at and we build from
Yes.
there as opposed to having unrealistic targets. And I think this is interesting when we think about other business contexts where say people talk about sales targets that are just unrealistic or they promise the market certain outcomes and it's kind of like a PR thing. And you go, well, we'll just tell them we're going to do this and everybody's happy, right? So it's a sort of aspirational thing. I love the fact that you've just gone, people will just look at them and go, it's ridiculous. And I think where we're asking people to do things that are uncomfortable and go against, report things, stand up, challenge, right? We don't want to set them these unrealistic targets or kind of pretend that if they find themselves in an ethical dilemma that they're weird, right? We don't,
Right.
it's almost like, here's a well, we don't have any ethical problems in this organization because we're 100% ethical type nonsense. And you'd sit there, if you were somebody that found yourselves in that position, actually the message I get from that kind of aspirational stuff is, oh God, this is the exception. This never happens. I don't raise this because this is so far off the standards or maybe I've screwed up slightly and I want help
Right.
fixing it. If I'm
Yes.
so far off the realities of the world as espoused by the management, then I'm kind of going, that makes the conversation, it's hard enough anyway. So I just really
Right.
like this idea of being honest. And I think ethics is about being honest and transparent and all these sorts of things. And so you're saying, let's bring a bit of it's almost is it a case of saying, "Let's be ethical in how we talk about ethics"?
Good one. I think you're onto something there, Christian. And I think the other piece that really comes into it is a piece about humility. Like there is a humility about that approach that reflects the reality of human nature. Kind of acknowledging that we're not as ethical as we think we are and updating our communications accordingly. And so interestingly, this was in 2010 that I did this, so a very long time ago now. And
Some of my listeners weren't even born then. No, I'm joking.
right, much before then. The so basically that was in 2010 and recently in Canada actually there was just a bill passed, Bill 59, a greenwashing bill that has very significant implications for Canadian companies as it relates to their communication about their ethics programs and their environmental initiatives in particular. That is, many people view it as really, really stringent. It is quite strict. And I think this bill in particular is literally trying to clamp down on the rampant, I hesitate to use the word greenwashing, but it is an overstatement, a kind of puffery in all aspects of communication that I actually believe come from, if we look at it from a behavioral ethics standpoint, it just simply comes from this idea that we naturally think we're better than we are. But that can get us into trouble if we communicate that, particularly in this environment where stakeholders have easy access into our organizations in a way that they never have before. They can see in. And effectively our organizations are permeable in a way that they never have been before, because people can see in, and then they can also, through social media or other channels, of course, share what they see. If they find a discrepancy between what we say and what we're doing, that can really have significant organizational consequences. And so I I think this approach is one that many organizations will almost have to take because, at least in Canada, because of this new legislation. But it's very different from what they're used to, and I think it will be a real struggle.
And so that presumably is more focused on externalities. So advertising would be a good example, what you say in your annual report, what you put on the product, that kind of thing. But the linkage is obviously clear that because of that consistency point, we can see inside, we need to make sure that what we're doing internally reflects that. And so this naturally takes us, this is much broader, I guess, than the sort of, for one of the better phrases, you say greenwashing thing. And to say, actually, we need to be a bit more realistic about what the world is actually like. So we can think about aspirations, but actually we should be reflecting on that. And so I love this idea of legislation that is designed to make sure companies are not dishonest or misleading in the public sphere, leads to a really interesting question about how they run internally and the sorts of language. And so the thinking that you were proposing way back then kind of is, you're humble enough never to say this, but it's kind of ahead of its time, right? It's pointing in exactly that direction. Because if we can't even have honest conversations internally, where that transparency was already clearly there and in those days, then that's going to be challenging externally. And so I love this idea that if organizations adopted the approach, they'd be front running a load of this stuff, right? Because you'd already have practiced that behavior and discipline internally, even if you weren't doing it externally.
Well, I think it's true, Christian. And one of the things that I think adds a additional layer of interest is that even though I was practicing this in 2010 and within the organization until I left in 2017, I would say that I know we're going to get to the next chapter of my work, but even though I knew everything that I knew about aligning words and actions, when I was in the CEO seat in the first iteration of my own entrepreneurial business, I would say that I still fell victim to a little bit of puffery in a way that I couldn't see because it was me that ultimately had a role in a significant shift that I know we're going to talk about. But I highlight that because it is extremely difficult to do,
Right.
but I think become increasingly important.
Right. And I think what is fascinating about this is that we often try and solve it in a simple way, right? And back to your point around let's have a clear articulation of how we would like the world to be, and then magically the behaviors will get themselves to that point, right? That feels like a nice, simple solution to it. And I think one of the reasons that we cleave to those simple solutions is, to your point, it's really hard, it's difficult, it's challenging for human beings. And so I think what's nice about what you've just said is clearly the idea. This is why I love starting the conversation talking about the younger you, right? There's a very idealistic approach. We join an organization, and there's something wonderful about having a kind of somebody that's coming in fresh, starting their career out. You can ask innocent questions, but we know that there are lots and lots of reasons why people get used to doing things a particular way. There are certain blind spots that we all have. This stuff is really, really hard. And so I think that's a really important calibration. On the one hand, you were able to have some early successes. On the other hand, I think your experience has taught you this is sometimes it's not as straightforward as we might think, often for good reason, but often also for bad reason. And so I think that's a really important calibration.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the kind of hopeful naivety that I went in to that organization with. And I think I had an experience as it relates to that led me to believe that we are in a different era of ethics than I had grown up in, effectively. And if you'd like, I can share a little bit about that, because I think for me, it really highlights what I see as a significant shift in terms of the era of ethics and risk that we're in.
Let's do that.
So as I mentioned, I was responsible or contributed to many of the things that we traditionally think about when we think of ethics and compliance. One of the things that I worked on was communicating our culture of integrity at the organization. And you might remember, and many of your listeners will remember, that in 2017, there were significant race-related protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this was one of the first times that CEOs began speaking out basically about racism and kind of taking a stand against racism. And I had done our work on the code of conduct. And at that time in 2017, the term like diversity, equity, inclusion was not something that we were hearing very regularly, but it was something sort of taking a stand against racism that many organizations were beginning to do. And I was sitting at my office in Calgary and thinking, we had done, speaking of this idea of kind of aligning words and actions and making sure that we don't take a stand for something if we don't also have clear actions lined up. There had been a few different things that had happened within the organization that I thought we'd done a relatively good job at supporting people in that vein, such that I thought it feels, from my perspective, appropriate that we might consider basically making a statement about this. And so I drafted up a memo that was on behalf of the leadership team, which was very typical for my role, and ran it by a few people in the legal department asking their perspective because I realized I hadn't been asked to do this, right? And they said, yeah, Morgan, you should definitely send this up. And so I did, feeling kind of good about myself, to be honest, Christian, thinking like, oh, I'm doing something good here. And basically, the response was not what I hoped. So it was, this is political. We're not getting into this. And effectively, don't ever do this again. And I just remember feeling crushed is the best way to describe it. I just remember thinking, wow, this organization is not the organization I thought it was. This doesn't align with my values. I have a much different perspective on what happened now. Like now looking back on it, that was in 2017. I have a very different perspective, a lot more understanding of like where the leaders were coming from, in that I have realized, having gone through something similar myself, kind of on the flip side, that actually dealing or addressing sort of employee requests around this stuff is very complex if you're not well equipped for it, which really not very many people are, in my experience. But the reason I highlight that is I think like that experience that I had is happening everywhere. Like in the work that I'm doing now, I hear about it all the time from all levels of the organization, within the C-suite, on boards, with line employees, where people are wanting an organization to do more as it relates to anything under sort of ESG, environment, social governance, and feeling a values disconnect or a misalignment when they don't see what they want. And again, because of the role of social media, they can communicate their discontent very easily and often have good case for doing so, especially when an organization has asserted itself as being a leader in this space. And so I'll maybe stop there.
Wow. I think that's just a really interesting insight. I think as you're sat there in that role, taking an almost what I would describe an entrepreneurial approach, right? So the way you talked about when you first started, and this is clearly built, you want to do a good job, right? And so you're looking and saying, how can I expand it's expanding the remit, not in a mission creep kind of way, but just in a kind of like, this feels like something we should be doing, right? And I want to take the essence, and I'm here to serve the organization in this way. And so I think this is an important thing that we ought to be doing. And you're tapping into the kind of the zeitgeist, I guess, and all the things that we see going around. And then you've hit the kind of, I guess, the realities of the world, the organization's willingness and ability to take those things on. And so I think that's incredibly interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's relevant to what we're going to come on and talk about. But I like the fact that we have to think about, I don't like the fact that it is complicated, but I think we have to recognize the complexities here of the dynamics that exist. And of course, all of this is about people and people's perspectives and perceptions of the world. And so what we're dealing with here isn't necessarily, these aren't logical problems. They are very emotional problems, and there are logistical, there's all sorts of things. It's messy, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Very messy, very messy. And I think the people don't often appreciate, I think, the way in which these types of ethics topics are deeply personal for people. And I think a lot of that reaction of like, this is political, we're doing fine, comes from a place of it being something that's really uncomfortable and tremendously difficult to even have a full appreciation kind of like oneself about what one thinks about like various topics in the world, then to possibly get alignment from a governance perspective on what our organization should do, what and how much we should do as it relates to anything under the ESG umbrella, and then actually enacting that through an organization. And I think my perspective is like many organizations have kind of gone along with I hesitate to, I'm not going to call it a trend, but have moved in the direction of embracing ESG in a way that I think if we look back at 2006 Morgan and then even 2017 Morgan, like very, very strong belief that organizations could have a positive impact. This socially responsible business very much was a part of like what I believed to be possible. I still believe that to be possible. And having had like a couple of very intense, very real life experiences, I have come to the perspective that while that is true, there is a limit, and that actually being like understanding where that limit is and being honest about it is really important, and actually is one of the things that we can do that has the highest integrity, is actually being honest about where it's hard.
And look, we've set the scene a little bit talking about your early career. Talk us, what's the next move that you make?
So after I kind of refer to it because literally I can see myself in the office feeling the way I did when I received that email back, like, this is political. I started to feel like this isn't necessarily a place I can see myself here for a long time. And effectively, the organization and I ended up parting amicably about 6 months later, which I think felt good and was a good move. And I had an interest in, and this is a gear shift that listeners will understand where we're headed in a few moments, but I'd always had an interest, in addition to my dad's entrepreneurial spirit, my mom was always very into design and fashion. And I inherited that from her. And after my second daughter was born, I began the process of building a capsule wardrobe, which at the time was just kind of a fun project that I was doing with a couple friends. The idea, for those who don't know, is that a capsule wardrobe is something it's a wardrobe that has fewer, better clothes in it. The idea is you can kind of mix and match different garments and live with fewer things. And I loved the idea of this. And so I began to pare down my own wardrobe. And as I did so and started to fill the gaps of what I needed, I began thinking in a way that I hadn't really before about how my clothes were made. And I actually, a side note at the same time, was taking a sewing class that really gave me an appreciation for the craft that goes into making a garment in a way that I had not appreciated before. And so kind of this idea of knowing where my clothes came from, and the idea of having clothes that were responsibly made, where people were paid well or at least appropriately for their work, and just thinking more about my garments generally. And because of my background in ethics, I realized that I had actually quite a unique insight into at least the ability to do kind of a cursory look at a company's website that sort of was purporting to be ethical, or even if it wasn't, to look and see kind of a few pieces about how they were making their clothes or what materials they were using, so that I could begin picking out what I would started talking about as responsibly made garments. And so basically, I was finding most of these makers on Instagram, and I began telling my own story of capsuling my wardrobe and filling these gaps with responsibly made things on Instagram. And quite quickly, some friends who were also going through this same process, they began purchasing the things that I was buying, basically. Like, I would find this cute pair of boots that were responsibly made in our province of Alberta, for example. And my friends would ask, like, where did you get those boots? And so I realized that if my friends were interested in these garments that I was kind of vetting, then maybe these Instagram followers, where at the time, I don't know how many followers I had at that time, maybe 3,000 or something, would maybe also be interested in them. And so basically, I came up with something called the virtual pop-up method, where we would run these online sales and photograph the garments that we had vetted on real models of all shapes and sizes with their measurements, and provide a discount code to our followers that they could use to purchase the garments that had basically been vetted by us on the makers' websites. So effectively, the garment was, and that was the name of my company, the garment was the connector between the makers who were making these responsibly made things and the community of women in the world who wanted them. And we had this mechanism for doing so, and the discount code basically tracked our sales, and we took a percentage.
Wow. So such a great explanation. So this is really organic, on brand for you. It's almost it's one of those businesses that you've created out of who you are and your experiences, where you haven't set out with a sort of, let me come up with a business model that I will get people to invest in. This is like, this is just something I'm doing because I believe in it. And oh, this is bigger than potentially just me helping friends. And so this is authentic and organic that you've built up based on your experience. And I think what's interesting is it's your personal, the two part. That's why it's almost a fusion of the two parents' influences on you and your career experience that takes you into this space. So this is authentically you. And I think this is a really important part of the story. This isn't you kind of going, how do I set up? It's grown organically, I guess, literally from your experiences.
Yes. And I think actually, and I hadn't fully made the connection actually until now, that what I was trying to do, kind of the impact of hoping to create a more inclusive, diverse culture or environment within the larger organization, and kind of struggling to that, I basically then did that with the garment. Like these real model shoots, nobody was doing this in 2017. Very few. I shouldn't say nobody, very few. And the mission of the company was to change the face of fashion by connecting women and responsible brands. And it was explicitly, and I think this part is really important, the business, well, not a social enterprise, because I was very clear that, like, I'm a capitalist. I believe in business. I love business. Maybe that's my dad's kind of banking side. But I also saw the potential to have a really positive impact in the world. And at the time, kind of early on, again, kind of naive Morgan, thought like, this is a very clear win-win, like business and doing good, right? But what I came to appreciate is that when an organization brands itself or positions itself as explicitly like in the middle of business and ethics, right in that centerpiece, as opposed to being like really far kind of on the right, like we're only capitalist, or pretty clear on the left, like we're going to do anything and we're more of a social enterprise, the boundaries get a bit blurred and it becomes difficult, at least I found it difficult, to then navigate stakeholder expectations, mostly from the left, around how much the organization ought to do. And that was where I found myself really challenged.
I think this is interesting because, again, this brings this theme of the theory of we're fusing these two worlds. Here's a nice path that's gonna encompass both of these things, that plays into your skill set, the intersect of the Venn diagram, if you like.
Yeah.
And you've got this thing that's established and it's authentic and I think that this is why I really want to emphasize this is you putting your heart and soul into a project that you believe in, that's driven by the values that you have and the way that you see the world. And so you've got this level of success. And of course, listeners can sense that there's something coming in a second that's going to make that story much more interesting. That's the start point of this. This is you really building from that piece. Tell us what happens then.
Yeah. So, I mean, things were going really quite well. So just to give listeners a sense, this was a small business. We generated over $1 million of responsible garment sales in our first corporate year. So there was a big demand for this stuff. We had the ability to track it. The business model was quite elegant in that we would run these sales, do these photo shoots, and then the makers would ship the garments to our customers, to their customers. Really, they weren't even ours. And everything was going quite well. Now, there were a few times when sort of during the early years of the garment where there were stakeholder expectations or requests, I would say, to do more as it related to many different things underneath the umbrella of what people might consider as responsibly made or ethical. And one of the things was inclusive sizing. So I'm diving into this a little bit to set some additional context for what ended up coming, because I think, and the reason I'm talking about specifics here is I think one of the things I've really noticed is in the spirit of what we've been discussing around this idea of kind of messaging and communicating about ethics. It's very easy at a high level to talk about, like, we run an ethical business. But the question of actually what that is and what that looks like, particularly in what I'm going to suggest is a sort of new era, this new era of ethics that we're in, is very complex in a way that I think people don't fully understand unless they've really experienced it. And so the inclusive sizing element was something that we had a relatively small number of our stakeholders, who were mostly women in larger bodies, expressed that they wanted to see more brands with inclusive sizing, both included in our regular pop-ups, which we always did. We always had at least one. But also they wanted a specific plus size pop-up. Okay. And so I didn't really know, should we do this or not, but I felt like it was probably the right thing to do. And so I decided that we would do it. And again, kind of going back to that mission of like changing the face of fashion. If we're changing the face of fashion, then we maybe should have, well, we definitely should have kind of more diverse bodies, if that's what we're talking about. Again, we already had those in our regular pop-ups, but the idea of doing kind of a standalone plus size pop-up was something that was important to a small group of our stakeholders. So we did this pop-up. I estimate that it took us about 3 times as much time, energy, and money to run the pop-up. There are a number of reasons for that. Like, I normally would test the garments. I couldn't do that, so we had to find other people to test them, all of these things. And we made half the amount of money. And so I share this as an example of like where these things can get hard, right? So should we have done that or not? I don't know. Like, if we didn't do it, there could have been a risk. If we did it all the time, we would have no business.
This is interesting because this isn't taking the business away from, so you're not suddenly going, here's a profitable niche that we can go after. You've got people asking you to do this. So this is already talking to your existing customer base. This is just expanding the range that you're already doing this to some extent. So if I looked at this from a commercial perspective, i.e. with the business half of the sort of brain, if you like, you'd be saying, well, this is just expanding a little bit. It's not opening a new thing. It's just taking a bit of what we're doing already. We know customers want this, and therefore it's logical from a business perspective. From the ethical side of things, again, it seems to make sense. It's on brand. So you're not taking a decision here that's wild and crazy, right? That is, in a way, I can make arguments on both fronts and saying that if you were just looking purely as a commercial business, you would make sense. If you were just looking, should we do this? Does it feel right? It's on brand for that. So what you've described to me here is it seems a very logical step to take given the dynamics that you've got there. And so this doesn't feel like a big misstep to me. And I think that's really important to sit back and acknowledge, right? This wasn't you going radically off the reservation for either of those two bits. If I looked at the business as the sort of intersect of the Venn diagram, I know that's hugely simplistic. But if we looked at it in that way, it's consistent with both of those things, right? So it doesn't feel like it's a wild, crazy, business-threatening decision.
Right. And I guess what I would say is I still kind of wonder, I'm not sure, like if because of from a commercial perspective, what it did do is it took the space of one of our other pop-ups, right? So it wasn't like it is expanding, but overall we made less money that year because we had one pop-up that made half the amount. But I think the sort of like potential risk of not doing it is also something that organizations don't really appreciate. And that risk can come like very quickly. And so I think that that is where that's one example of where I see it being quite challenging for leaders to know, like, how much should we do? And actually, I mean, if we connect it to like larger fashion businesses, like Old Navy, for example, did a big push into the inclusive size market, like went fully into it. People might remember kind of when that happened, and loads of marketing and stuff all around inclusivity. And basically, it from a commercial perspective, it did not go well. They ended up like they had a really quite significant challenge in that all the middle sizes were gone in the stores, and they had lots of larger sizes and lots of smaller sizes. Now, it's not that it's impossible. So I think it's athletic. They have done, I think, quite a beautiful job at like really integrating inclusivity into their business model, in that from top to bottom, that was kind of always who they were. They've done a really good job at that. They have training for employees around how to talk about larger bodies, for example. Like, they've really done kind of all in on it. And I think it has done quite well. So it's not that it's not possible. It's just there are lots of different considerations that I think people don't often fully appreciate.
So tell us what happened.
Okay. So if we think back to what I shared about the ethics office, and in that environment, I was the person feeling like our organization perhaps ought to do more and take a stand against racism. When George Floyd was killed, many people will know that there was really significant, how do I articulate this? Significant questions for organizations about what and how much they were doing as it related to taking a stand against racism. And those questions very quickly, in the form of Instagram direct messages, came to me and to our team. And given what we had already been doing within the business, I thought the question of what and how much more ought we to do was a question that was important and that warranted careful thought and consideration before making a commitment. And if we think back to what we talked about at the beginning, kind of this idea of aligning words and actions, because I'm so mindful of the way in which we often like overcommit, make bullshit commitments, do all of this stuff, I wanted to be really clear that anything that we did in addition to what we were already doing was really well thought out, so that we could make sure to honor it. And that it was something that wasn't performative, and that really would hopefully make a positive impact, and that would be good from a business perspective. And in that space of Morgan Hamel kind of thinking through what we should do and talking with, I had one employee at the time she and I would often talk about these questions. People made up what that silence from the garment and Morgan Hamel meant. So this idea that the business doesn't care, there's not really a commitment here, was something that I think was, at least from a very small number of stakeholders, was something that they kind of like inferred. They took the silence to mean that. And quite quickly, that kind of the people's inference of what that meant began to be shared online, and kind of calls for the garment to take a stand, right? Which is ironic, because this is literally what I was doing in some ways, although very much more professionally and in a different way, but in the ethics office, right? But I had so much more of an understanding at that point, a kind of more mature understanding, I would say, of like where things can get complex. But basically, because I was not prepared for that pressure, it ended up basically resulting in an environment where I began to feel like I could no longer lead the organization, which sounds really quite like, people are like, what do you mean? Like, what actually happened? And the reality is, like, nothing really happened. it was just the calls to do more were so strong, and my desire to put out something that was authentic and also like meaningful and good and wasn't offensive to people of color, like there was so complex that in that pause, I basically made the decision that it was so challenging that I didn't know how to move forward. And I ended up making what was a really devastating decision to close the business.
Wow. I mean, just the way you talk about this and your thoughtfulness around it and your awareness of the subject, that conclusion sounds very surprising. Because if I were looking at it, you'd be saying, here is someone who is running, and this is why I always wanted to pull these bits out, right? You're running a business that you really understand, that's driven by you and your vision, that is authentic. You're not going against any of the principles. And you've been through this. You understand ethics as an academic subject, and you've been taught there. You've seen the practical realities of it. You've had some successes. So if I looked at it and said, this ought to be the moment that you're equipped to deal with, right? So even if you didn't see it coming, relative to anybody else doing this, one would go, Morgan's going to be well equipped to handle this. And so that feels I'm sitting here with huge amounts of sympathy, because I'm thinking you're not going to be wanting to, all of that points towards giving this up is like a major thing, because this is literally your baby, your business. You've grown it yourself. It's organic, it's authentic, and it's a challenge that you've got some experiencing in handling, right? So this feels like a really big thing that I guess sounds surprising given all of those dynamics.
I certainly agree, Christian. And I was surprised myself at how ill-equipped I felt to navigate it. And actually, after I made the announcement that the business was closing, I reached out to my friend and mentor, who some of your listeners will probably know of, Keith Darcy. Keith used to be the executive director of the Ethics and Compliance Officer Association in the US. And I affectionately refer to him as the grandfather of ethics and compliance. So when I worked in the ethics office, we would go down to the ECOA conferences, and I reached out to Keith. We had kind of lost touch since I'd left the ethics office, but I reached out to him after my experience at the garment, honestly, because it was a very difficult time for me. And I was trying to understand what happened. Like, why could someone with my level of expertise in this area not navigate this in the way that I would have wished that I would have been able to? And we ended up actually collaborating on an essay together. Basically, the idea was to kind of understand, how has the world shifted such that basically Morgan or any other leader who thinks of themselves as well equipped to navigate this is struggling, or if they're not struggling, they might consider thinking, wow, do I really know what I'm doing? And so basically together we worked on this essay, and we came up with a distinction that I hope that your listeners will find valuable, which is basically the pre-2012 and post-2012 era. So 2012 being the year when likes and shares became a thing on social media. And so at this point, basically, even though it didn't make a huge impact until about 2017, the technology was there starting in 2012. And so basically, this creates an environment where when we talk about that permeability of an organization, the ability of any stakeholder to voice their concerns or perspective on what an organization ought to do really began to be in place. And so if you think about my decision to do a plus size pop-up or any of these things that we ended up deciding to do, there's kind of a mix of, we think it's the right thing to do. Also, it's good for business, but also we have these stakeholders who are asking us very publicly to do it. And that element, that kind of idea of post-2012 pressure, is something that I think few leaders really appreciate. And so we define post-2012 pressure as pressure for a business to take a stand or position, or even engage in, I would say, enter a new market potentially, on topics including but not limited to racial equity, gender equality, climate change, vaccination, LGBTQIA plus rights, income equality, and abortion. The list goes on. We can imagine, and for many organizations in different businesses, there might be other areas when their response or lack thereof can be exacerbated by social media. So to kind of bring us back to the ethics office, I think I was in some ways exerting post-2012 pressure, again, in kind of the professional context in a subtle way because I thought it was the right thing to do. But I was also the recipient of post-2012 pressure. And what Keith and I ended up agreeing on within our essay was that this is an entirely new era of ethics and risk. We've got kind of our pre-2012 topics on one side, which would be all of the things that we traditionally think of that are in our codes of conduct. But we also have all of those post-2012 risks on the other hand, which are what I just mentioned. And that being very clear as a organization from first, I would say, like at the board level, about what and how much we are going to do as it relates to each of these topics and how we are going to handle the pressure that will certainly come as it relates to them is critically important.
So much to compute there and process, and I can only imagine the psychological pressures on you. And I say I can only imagine them. I probably can't, but I'm thinking you're not facing, in the situation that you described, you're not facing direct, immediate, clear and present financial danger. This is
No.
psychological pressure on you. So if you looked at it from a business perspective, you can probably theoretically navigate this, but you're just going, I've had enough. The pressure has got to me. And that's what's driven that particular decision. And so this is a psychological thing rather than a logical thing, I guess.
Yes, and I think that is really important, Christian, because I think that is actually the piece where many leaders end up struggling. And I don't think many people have a full appreciation of how important our reputations are to us as humans. And when our reputations are threatened or feel like they're being threatened, people will do almost anything to kind of like try to save their reputation. And many leaders are experiencing this now where they're kind of caught in the polarity trap, I call it, or the polarization trap. Where, I mean, if we think of Bud Light, right? I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with the experience that they had with Dylan Mulvaney, where they basically made a decision in an effort to capture a additional market share of younger, more progressive beer drinkers. They formed a partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, the transgender influencer. And they ended up experiencing really quite significant backlash from their conservative customer base as it related to that partnership. It ended up resulting in $6 billion in market cap loss. So extremely significant. And the reason that I'm sharing this is I think if you're the CEO of Anheuser-Busch, right, and you have like all of these, regardless of what you think about the issue, if 85% of your customer base is like pressuring you saying this is bad, I think people need to anticipate that kind of thing is going to happen and prepare themselves, not only, as you say, like from a business perspective, but for what that's like as a human, to basically be called effectively, like be called bad by a large group of people is really significant. And I think that a lot of people don't fully appreciate what that is like. And the idea of preparing for it in advance might seem unnecessary. But if we look at how often this is happening, if we look at university presidents who are navigating how challenging this polarization trap is as it relates to Israel-Palestine, Like it is so complex, and I think that it's an area that deserves a lot more attention.
And the thing I find fascinating about it is that obviously you're coming under pressure from one side of a debate. But if you look at the Anheuser-Busch thing, it's not necessary, because if you thought about traditionally, it's normally people that are trying to change something who are the ones, so if we think of suffragettes or any sort of civil rights movements, we're trying to change the status quo. We've also now got, and so that's one form of pressure that's always been there that can be exacerbated. But as you've rightly pointed out, the pressure can come from people that don't want that change. And so this isn't
Absolutely.
necessarily going to hit you from one side. You could get hit, you could get squeezed in the middle by both sides. And so we have to be thinking, and this is why I think thinking about it as a psychological challenge is, it isn't just here is the obvious crowd of people that are going to be irritated by this. We could find ourselves having two different perspectives and kind of annoying everybody.
Absolutely, Christian. And certainly, so one of the pieces of work that I do now is teaching on the topic of moral polarization. So we can dive into that in a moment if you want. But one of the groups that I do a lot of work with are CPA organizations, the accountants. And I feel tremendously fortunate to get to spend quite a lot of time with CPAs from across Canada, but also increasingly in other countries in the world, as it relates to getting their perspectives on these topics. So we talk about the Bud Light case in my courses. And what I can tell you, both anecdotally and from some of the data that we've gathered, is that what you described, that idea of kind of being pinched from both sides, is very real. And the challenges, I think, for leaders and organizations is that every individual leader will naturally find themselves kind of either on one side or somewhere in the middle. But we often naturally think that most people think like us, right? So if we're kind of more on the left and we're thinking diversity, equity, inclusion, ESG, these are great things. How could anybody think any differently? We will naturally kind of set up our organizations, communicate our initiatives in a way that reflects that we think these things are good. We might not understand that potentially up to 50% or maybe even more of our members or people might actually have a different perspective. And I see this a lot. And organizations are increasingly hearing from those members, I would say mostly privately, but sometimes not, in a way that is inviting them to reconsider. But it is difficult. It is difficult given where they stand. And the idea of it's very hard not to see people who have a different perspective than me, no matter which side you're on, as kind of bad. And that's where that term of moral polarization, I think, is really important to understand. And basically, the idea there is that moral polarization is this idea that if you have a different perspective than me, I view you not only as wrong, but as bad. And that makes it extremely difficult for conversations about these sensitive topics to go well, because it's just hard to even get to the place of even having a conversation about it.
As you're talking, and I know you've had time to reflect on this, but I'm really intrigued that you're not, I don't know, more angry, because yeah, as I reflect, you're talking very calmly about the dynamics there, and you're a thoughtful person, right? So you will have understood the prevailing winds that have driven, or the tectonic plates that are shifting here. So you've got a level of understanding of the dynamic, right? So this isn't just a visceral. You can step back a little bit and think about it, but nonetheless, you've been through a thoroughly unpleasant experience, right? And somebody with, clearly you've got strength of character and all those things that just comes across in the way you talk and the way that you structure your career. And I'm astonished that there isn't more anger there.
I like that you asked that question. I have always been someone who has had a pretty easy time seeing both sides. And I think that is reflected in even that idea of kind of business and ethics. Business on one side, ethics on the other, like in the middle. And so I think part of why let's see, I would say there is definitely some anger and sadness that happened. but it's not as strong as my desire to transform it into something that can both make money and make a better world again. The desire to do that is stronger. And so I kind of have like used that to fuel this next piece of my career, which is what I'm doing now, which is basically helping boards, executive teams, professional organizations navigate this new era of moral polarization.
From a position of being incredibly qualified to talk about it, right? This is the key bit. You have lived this, and so I guess that gives you subject matter expertise. But I think given we're talking about psychological challenge, it's kind of hard for somebody. I'm thinking about it would be very hard for me to talk to somebody about their experience in the military because I haven't got it. You're trying to equip people to handle. Of course, there's the logical, there's the comms solution to these things, and there's based on what you're saying, is obvious. Like if you have a plan, you are going to be better equipped to handle this sort of thing. You could, but you're dealing with much more than that, right? You're looking at the psychological pressures on these people and thinking about what does this really feel, and you need to be ready for this. And it's kind of not plausible it's less plausible to have that conversation if you haven't been through it, and you're probably one of the few people that's had an extreme experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, unfortunately, I think it's more common than people think as it relates to kind of having the experience. I mean, really, even though I kind of hesitate to use this word, like my experience was basically one of cancellation. Now, the question of how much of a role I actually played in that, I think is really interesting. Like, I do think there's an element of like, I allowed myself to be canceled, right? But that has to do with what we talked about around this, the psychological element of it, and that it was so challenging. And I think all of the things that you outline in terms of this being like very personal to me was perhaps a bit different than a larger organization. But I think still that idea of like people holding their reputation as very important to them is relevant. I have been surprised at, given that I've had this experience, how many other people also have had it. And I have actually kind of made a practice through my work of, when I learn of someone who is going through something similar to what I experienced, of reaching out to them, like just pro bono, and offering to have a call, just because I know how deeply challenging it is, and how there are not very many people in the large scheme of things who've had that experience. And so I would say certainly the psychological part is one piece of it. But from an organizational like governance perspective and business ethics perspective, there is a really significant opportunity to help your organization navigate this risk. And I think business ethics professionals, risk professionals, even I've seen it with the CPAs, which has been really, really interesting. People who are maybe leading ESG teams. Like, the interesting thing about moral polarization is it is a significant business risk. In fact, the World Economic Forum, it was actually a board member who I do some work with who sent me this World Economic Forum Global Risks report. I don't know if you've seen it, but they recently launched this 2024 report, and societal polarization is listed as number 3 on the global risks rated by severity over the short term, which is the next 2 years. That is above both cybersecurity and interstate armed conflict. Okay? So this idea of polarization as a business risk is massive. And I have been surprised at what I perceive to be a lack of, what would I even call it? Sophistication, maybe? Like, level of being equipped of the large consulting firms to help their organizations navigate this. And so in the work that I'm doing now, we have a program that we take organizations through to help the C-suite and board identify polarization risk, get clear on which contested issues to take a stand on, update policies and communications accordingly, and then prepare for those polarizing pushes. And that is, I think, something that will become increasingly important for organizations to mitigate risk, but also on the flip side, potentially as a competitive advantage. If you look at, you describe both sides and being squeezed in the middle, the idea of like taking a side and like clearly trying to choose either the right or left, it's an option, but you basically lose 50% of your people. And it's really hard to do because you have folks on all notches all across the spectrum. So the idea of taking a depolarized approach to branding, where if you look at the bell curve, you know, maybe taking the 80% in the middle and taking a depolarized approach to communications where you're not going hard in on the messaging that might turn off the other side, is something that I think is a really significant business and branding opportunity that not many organizations are consciously doing.
My sense is the way you're talking about it, smaller organizations probably less of a challenge. But if you're a large company, this is a when, not an if, right?
100%.
Because
Yeah.
something that you do somewhere, somehow, like even if it's not core. And what's interesting, of course, if you're large enough, people are going to view you as a vessel to project things onto. So if I can't, and I guess to a certain extent, if I can't get satisfaction from my politicians, then maybe I can vent with corporates, right? And because I'm a consumer and I have rights, particularly companies that I can do something. And so that's an access point to activism, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Allison Taylor, who I know has been on your show, you know, talks a lot about this, about the idea that, you know, given that trust in our political institutions is so low, the kind of that employee activism has really shifted. And certainly many of the organizations that I work with are seeing that in a very real way. And it has significant implications for attraction and retention, right? I've talked to lots of people, again, on both sides, who either when they're looking for an organization to work for, depending on which side they're on, if they feel strongly on either side, they will either be looking for a diversity, equity, inclusion statement and saying, yes, if I see one, I want to work there. Or they will be looking for a diversity, equity, inclusion statement and seeing it and saying, no, I don't want to work there. And that, I mean, if you think of the implication of that for HR, it's significant. But, and I know that Chloe Valderi was on your show and that we're going to be doing a piece with her as well. I believe and have evidence of there is a way to do DEI that is depolarized. And that is when we're talking about that bell curve, that sort of 80% is a really significant opportunity.
So Morgan, we've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything else that I ought to ask you?
Christian, I think we have indeed covered a lot of territory. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think from my side, that's a wrap.
Amazing. Listen, what an inspirational story. Thank you for being incredibly transparent, engaging, honest about what I know must have been one hell of an experience. So many more questions I'd love to ask you, and we will be having further conversations. But look, thank you for sharing that very, very personal experience and some really deep personal anecdotes of a time that I know was challenging for you. And so thank you for coming in and doing that. And above all, thank you for being just an amazing guest on the show and being really inspirational in everything you do.
Thanks so much, Christian.